Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon. My guest today is Cara Robertson. She began researching the Lizzie Borden case as a Harvard undergraduate in 1990. She now holds a PhD from Oxford University and a Juris Doctorate from Stanford Law School. She clerked at the Supreme Court of the United States, served as a legal advisor to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at The Hague, and has written for various publications. Her scholarship has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Humanities Center, of which she is a trustee. The Trial of Lizzie Borden is her first book, and that will be our topic of discussion today. Of the book, New York Times bestselling author John Meacham says, "With deft storytelling and convincing scholarship, Cara Robertson does the seemingly impossible by bringing new life to perhaps our oldest true crime saga, the Gilded Age case of Lizzie Borden, by giving us Fall River, Massachusetts in full and in context, as well as the panoply of characters who made the trial so sensational. Robertson has written the rarest of things, a page-turner with a point, and we are very pleased to have the distinguished attorney and scholar with us today. Welcome, Cara.
Hi, Rob.
So can you tell me how you initially got interested in the story of Lizzie Borden and the trial of Lizzie Borden?
My interest in the story of Lizzie Borden goes way back when I was a student. And, I think on some level I was always interested in unsolved mysteries and great trials. But the combination of the two in the Lizzie Borden story in a little town in New England really fascinated me since I was a student not too far away. And I was looking for something that would give me a real window onto the period. And a great public trial like that of Lizzie Borden, where there's just such intense press coverage and national, even international interest, gives one a terrific window onto the period writ large. And of course, it's a great American unsolved mystery.
Cara, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today, we have axe murderer Imperial Stout from Moon Tower Sudworks of Houston, Texas. This stout has a black body with a tan foam, dark fruit aromas, dark roast, dark chocolate, tangy dark fruit flavors. I think you kind of get the picture. Axe murderer is very dark, but it has a very easy finish and is extremely tasty. Remember, the best way to enjoy an episode is with one of our featured brews. I would also like to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Simply click on the subscribe button on the directory that you use and get the newest material immediately after it is published. Subscribing is the only way to get the new shows right away. To the ever-expanding list of supporters and listeners from 75 countries and over 2,000 cities across the globe, I have to say thank you. And now I raise my axe murderer Imperial Stout very high. And to all of those that brave the darkness to hunt the monsters among us, even when the trail runs cold, I say cheers. If we go to some background, what's the story of Andrew Jackson Borden and what's the situation of the Borden family in 1892?
Andrew Borden is a prominent local businessman in the town of Fall River, Massachusetts, which was then the largest textile producing town in the state and in America. It was a town with great extremes of wealth and poverty, and he was descended from one of the richest families in Fall River, but from a lesser line. And he was essentially a self-made man whose interests were mostly in real estate, what you might think of as commercial real estate, renting out shop spaces, that sort of thing. And as one reporter later said, he was more interested in piling up dollars than spending them. Although he was noted to be a very rich man, he lived on what you might say was a narrow scale in a modest house, not very far from the center of town where he could keep track of his business interests, as opposed to living in a grander style in the elite residential district on the hill.
So for Lizzie Borden, then, I know that Andrew Jackson Borden had 2 wives. What's her basic background? There appears to be a great deal of tension in the house. Is there anything in her situation that might be questionable or give people pause or unease?
Well, Andrew Borden had 2 daughters, Emma and Lizzie. They were about 9 years apart, and Andrew Borden's first wife, the daughter's biological mother, died when Lizzie was only 3 years old. About 2 years later, he married another woman named Abby, who effectively raised Lizzie, so with a lot of assistance from Emma, the older sister, who had apparently promised her mother that she would always look after her baby sister. And so, perhaps not surprisingly, as they grew to adulthood, there was some tension in the family. And then Andrew Borden, despite his reputation for being a bit of a miser, gave his wife some property basically to bail out her side of the family. And that caused a lot of resentment in the house. When the daughters found out about it, they confronted their father and said basically what he did for her family, in other words, Abby's family, he ought to do for his own kind. And he gave them a house of comparable value from which they could derive some rental income. But it didn't seem to heal the breach. So it's not really clear whether there was always a fair amount of tension and this really just brought it to the surface, or whether this, in fact, is the thing that created the tension. But what we do know is that by 1892, this was not a happy home. The adult daughters who were living still at home, as was typical in that era, tried to conduct their social lives as separately as possible from their father and stepmother, even going so far as to eat dinner separately and often entertaining people in a small guest room upstairs so as to avoid their stepmother.
So there was an event in May of 1892, and Andrew Borden kills multiple pigeons in a barn with a hatchet. And Lizzie had built a roost for those pigeons. His excuse when he gives it is very weak on the reasoning why he did it in the first place. Could you explain that event, and do you think, it's going to be tough to determine, obviously, but do you think that Lizzie harbored resentment because of that?
Yeah, a lot has been made of this pigeon story. I think it's a little bit like one of those myths that has grown up around the case. I'm not saying that there's nothing at all in it, but it also would have been fairly typical to eat squab. So I think this is an example of the sort of thing that happens around events that are difficult to explain, that people look backward and take fairly ordinary things as signs of something really foreboding, when in fact, it probably wouldn't have seemed very remarkable but for the fact that there were murders afterwards.
There was a family argument that you mentioned before, and the 2 older daughters moved away or were on, quote, a vacation in New Bedford. Was that over that real estate gift that Andrew gave to their stepmother's family?
Well, I'm not sure what exactly you're referring to about the timing. The real estate transaction happened about 5 years before the murders in 1887. And there is, as I said, this tension that comes to the surface or is created by that. And as I said, it's a little bit hard to tell how bad things were before, but we know that things were pretty tense afterwards. And afterwards, we also know that there are examples of Lizzie Borden expressing her dislike of her stepmother to people who would listen to it, and basically cutting in the old-fashioned sense of the word. In other words, like socially not acknowledging members of her stepmother's family. So they thought she was a very proud, dislikable person as a result.
And I think in your book, you mentioned that sometimes the stepmother is referred to as mother, and she makes it clear that that's not her mother.
Right. This is a point that's really held against her. I mean, we know that she called her mother, Lizzie called Abby mother until that dispute over the real estate, and then thereafter referred to her as Mrs. Borden. Emma, who was older at the time of the remarriage, never really called her mother. So, the difference in attitude wasn't so noticeable. And we also know that in just a fairly casual conversation with the dressmaker about 5 months before the murders, Lizzie referred to the stepmother as basically a mean, good-for-nothing thing. Don't say she's my mother.
If we go to the event itself, or the murder itself, August 4th, 1892, could you take us through in detail what happened on that day?
Well, in some respects, it was a fairly typical day. It was just an ordinary August day in Fall River, Massachusetts, likely to be a little bit too hot in the way that August days often are there. There were 5 people known to be in the house that day, and they're worth going through because they're not necessarily the people you would think of offhand. Andrew and Abby Borden, the people who will end up dead that day. Lizzie, who lived in the house. The housemaid, Bridget Sullivan, and Andrew Borden's brother-in-law from his first marriage, John Morse, who was Lizzie's biological uncle. He'd come in the night before. He occasionally visited, but this was a noteworthy event. I mean, he could have been a precipitating factor, if we believe that the murderer was in the house, but he was the unusual person in the household at the time. Emma was visiting friends in Fairhaven, some distance away, so she wasn't really in the picture. Anyway, the morning starts off, fairly typically. The older generation gets up early and has breakfast. Andrew walks into his business in the city. John Morse also leaves early because he wants to visit some relatives on the other side of town. Abby directs Bridget, the housemaid, to wash the windows inside and out, which turn out to be something that's going to give Bridget an alibi, so she should be grateful for the task, which is otherwise, fairly onerous. Lizzie Borden comes down after the older people have eaten and mentions to the housemaid that there's a sale on fabric in a store downtown that she might like to take advantage of. And then after that, it's a little unclear who is where at what time, but what we do know is that around 9:30 in the morning, Abby is killed by 19 blows in an upstairs guest room. And about an hour and a half later, Andrew Borden received 10 blows as he lay sleeping on the sitting room sofa. He had come back from his business in the city around 10:45 or 11 and was greeted by Lizzie and by Bridget, the housemaid. At that point, he inquired for Mrs. Borden, his wife, and Lizzie said that she had received a note from a sick friend and had gone out. And then he proceeded to take a nap, and that ended up as his final slumber. We know that Lizzie Borden summoned Bridget around noon, and then the ball was rolling to publicize the murders.
So the investigation then, immediately, who comes, what detectives or police arrive at the house? Investigative work must have been in its infancy at that point. What were some of those early missteps that the initial investigation had?
Yeah, I think for those of us who are used to current crime dramas and procedures, it does seem like a slightly bumbling investigation. We know that when the first policeman came, that what he noticed really was only the death of Mr. Borden, and the fact that Mrs. Borden was upstairs dead wasn't discovered immediately. This was also true of the doctor who originally examined the body. One of the most striking things is how many people come in and out of the house that day, particularly early on. Neighbors, friends, well-wishers, looky-loos, pretty much anyone who wanted to, seemed to come by. There are a number of interesting first-person accounts of what Mr. Borden looked like. One witness said that his face resembled raw meat, but noticed that the house itself was an apple pie order. And these are just, although fascinating to us, are things that you would think you wouldn't want outsiders taking a gander at this point. What the police noticed most significantly is that is that there were two things that really seemed to rule out the idea of a murderous stranger. That, of course, was everyone's first thought, that this must be some insane person, probably an immigrant, based on the criminological theories of the time. But they noticed that the front door and basement were locked, so that the only apparent entry point was a side door, and that was not only usually latched, but also could be seen by one of the neighbors who was herself a bit of a looky-loo, and is the person who spotted Lizzie Borden standing just inside that door after discovering her father's body and waiting for the housemaid to return with a doctor. There was also the question of the interval between the murders. Mr. Borden died at least an hour and a half, maybe as much as 2 hours after his wife. And so that presented the obvious question, would an outside assassin, particularly some insane person, have lingered in the house after dispatching Abby Borden for that length of time just to wait for Andrew's return? And even if that person had been inclined to do so, would he really have been able to hide himself? It was a narrow house, and it had been converted from a two-family house into a single-family house, which meant that there were no hallways, and there weren't many places really for anyone to hide, so that such a person would probably have been at risk of discovery unless he happened to know the house really well.
So then when does Lizzie become, say, a person of interest and then the primary suspect? Is it because of those things that you just outlined?
First, it seems like an outside perpetrator is not likely. And so then, as you can imagine, the suspicion turns to the people who are actually known to be in the house that morning. And the most obvious candidate was John Morse. One, because he's a man. Two, because he's the person who really doesn't belong there. But he was known to have departed shortly after breakfast, almost an hour before Abby died. And more than that, he had an alibi that seemed to be out of, an Agatha Christie novel. He said he'd been riding on a horse car with 6 priests. The conductor didn't remember him, but did recall the priest.
Not 5. 6 priests.
Yeah. So a suspicion might have then fallen on Bridget Sullivan, who was vulnerable because she was an Irish immigrant. And the police tended to look to that community first when there was a crime, though there certainly wasn't a crime like this one in recent memory in Fall River. But she, fortunately, had been told to wash the windows, and she had been spotted outside chatting with the neighbor's housemaid at exactly the time that Abby Borden was thought to have been murdered. And Lizzie Borden's own account of her event seemed to put Bridget away from suspicion, or as far away from suspicion. So that really just left Lizzie Borden in the house. She gave shifting accounts of her whereabouts during the critical period. She said she'd been downstairs ironing handkerchiefs when Abby was killed, yet hadn't heard a sound. As I mentioned, this was a small house, and it was thought odd that she wouldn't have heard anything when Abby fell. And I should just say parenthetically that this little detail of the case is something that continues to fascinate people and turns them into kind of amateur detectives. If you take a tour of the house, which is available, then people often will fall upstairs, and leave a compatriot downstairs to see if that person can be heard. And then at the time that her father was murdered, Lizzie said that she had gone outside to the barn in search of a sinker, wait for a fishing line, or perhaps a piece of lead to fix a screen. And she'd taken a few pears with her and then decided to eat those in the barn. And all this just seemed very suspicious. Perhaps even stranger was that upon discovering her father's body, she hadn't thought to look for her stepmother, claiming that, Abby had received a note and gone out. And then later said, maybe that she had heard her come in, which spurred the belated discovery of her stepmother's body upstairs. Those were things that seemed to create opportunity. And then there was this matter of the Cold War between the generations, the tension in the household that seemed to supply a motive.
So you have a situation where someone gets bludgeoned to death and an hour or so later someone else does. It just seems odd that there wouldn't be blood all over the place, all over clothing or something, or between the two locations, no matter who did it.
Yeah, so this is probably the greatest point in Lizzie Borden's favor, is that she is examined by many people because they're sitting in the room with her, comforting her, or they see her, or they interview her at the time shortly after the murders. And no one ever sees anything that suggests that she cleaned up, or, in other words, her hair wasn't wet, her dress is totally in order, her hands are very clean. There's nothing to suggest blood spatter. I mean, later it emerges that she must have changed her dress in the morning. I mean, we know that she changed her dress between the morning and the afternoon, but she sent a dress to the police, so that they could examine it, and it was found to be free of blood. But there was another dress, and this is the point of real, contention at the trial. But there's another blue dress that she burns the weekend after the murders, although she is able to show that it had been stained with paint. And she gives that as her rationale for having burned it.
If you would recreate it like they do some of these cases, and they show splatter and so forth just on one hit, let alone multiple hits, it just amazes.
Right.
But it happened, so somebody did it. If you're an insane person that came in and just started hacking away, you're not going to concern yourself about cleaning up or not making blood splatter.
Right.
If you're just insane and just going to kill people, and really that's the only thing that makes any sense. You'd have to have somebody who's deranged to hit somebody that many times, because if you're just trying to kill someone, you don't hit them 17 times or in 10 or 11 times or whatever. I mean, it's just not necessary if your goal is just to kill the person.
Exactly, right.
So it either has to be a deranged person,
so personal, right?
or something inherently deeply angry.
The thing that people say about it is that either, obviously it's just somebody who's just lashing out, somebody who came in from outside and just managed to take advantage of the 1 in a million opportunity to get in and out undetected, or it's somebody who's got a real grudge against these people such that she or he wants to focus all those blows on their face.
So she's arrested, and of course there'll be a trial. It starts in early summer 1893. So let's start with the prosecution. Who's the district attorney and who's on that team, and what's their strategy going into the trial?
The prosecution is very well represented by a man named Hosea Knowlton, who's the chief prosecutor of Bristol County. He's based in New Bedford. And he's not thrilled about having to deal with the case. He was viewed as a kind of tender-hearted man and who was fairly chivalrous. So I don't think he relished the idea of prosecuting Lizzie Borden. But he noted, for the reasons that we've discussed, that she seemed to be the only person with opportunity, that she had exclusive opportunity. And then in addition to the motive that was outlined, there was also evidence that Lizzie Borden tried to buy prussic acid the day before the murders. And the argument there is not that the Bordens were poisoned, but rather that would go some way to explain why someone like Lizzie Borden would pick up an axe or a hatchet, this was more likely the case, and kill her father and stepmother in that manner. That was seen as a very male way to kill. It was not a woman's weapon, particularly not a church-going, upper-middle-class lady's weapon. And so the thought that she had had murder on her mind and had intended to buy prussic acid and then was thwarted in her ability to use this more feminine form of deadly weapon, that went some ways towards explaining the method of the crime as well as the motive. And he was assisted, I should say, by another young prosecutor who was from Haverhill in Massachusetts, who was the district attorney there and who would later go on to serve as Attorney General of the United States and sit on the Supreme Court. And his name was William Moody, and he was also an extremely capable prosecutor. So at the outset, it looked a little bit dark for Lizzie.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of things are going against her at that point. And for the defense team, then, who comprises that group, and what's their strategy, knowing all of the things, as you just mentioned, that lines up against her?
Borden is first represented by the family lawyer, whose name is Andrew Jennings. And although he is, a very capable man, he sees that he needs assistance. So he hires a very well-regarded trial lawyer from Massachusetts named Melvin Adams, particularly to combat the scientific and medical evidence. And then he goes a step even further and hires the former governor of Massachusetts named George Robinson, composing a sort of O.J. Simpson-esque dream team. Robinson is a figure who contrasts strongly with Prosecution in that he's a very folksy man who seems like he's just chatting with the jury. I mean, almost like a caricature of that kind of...
Like Matlock or something.
The folksy Southern lawyer, but he's very much a Yankee. Whereas the other lawyers are much more methodical and extremely well-grounded in the law. The defense lawyer, Robinson, has this, terrific sense of people, and is able to tell a story that's much more convincing, even if it's not as strong on the evidence as the prosecution case is. So I should say that Lizzie Borden herself is essentially the best weapon in her own defense, because she seems so unlike the sort of person based on then prevailing theories of criminality, then prevailing notions of what women were capable of, particularly women like her. It just seems so implausible that she would do such a thing, despite the circumstantial evidence against her.
Leading up to the trial, I believe there's another axe murder that occurs in Fall River. Is that allowed to be known during the trial? It seems like it shouldn't be admissible.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. The month before the trial, there is this horrible murder in the area in which an insane Portuguese immigrant killed the daughter of his employer. So, in other words, killed a woman. And, in that case, it exactly fit what people would expect. The killer is somebody who is, essentially crazy. There's a dispute over wages, and the immigrant picks up a weapon and kills this woman who is described in ways that, suggest that she's a very dutiful daughter. And that's a story that effectively makes sense, unlike the Borden murders. And we know that this was much in the papers right before the jury is selected, and that the jury is sequestered just as news of this man's arrest is put in the papers. So it's not clear whether or not the jurors would have known anything at all about the arrest, but they would have known about the murders and could well have thought that there's some, as one waggish journalist put it, that there was some Jack the Chopper in the area.
If we go to the autopsy itself, was there anything revealed in that? And then I think there's an interesting case. I don't know if something like this even occurs today, but they removed the heads of the victims and then used the skulls as evidence during the trial. Is that correct?
Yeah, I know. That seems shocking. And probably even more shocking is the not super reliable story, but one of the descendants of the coroner said that the coroner had actually rendered the flesh off the skulls in lobster pots that he kept at the house.
Oh, jeez.
The skulls were examined and then removed to show the nature of the wound, make sure that they were counting properly, and also so that they could test the weapon or the prospective murder weapon in the skulls. The skulls, in addition to the just providing them a sort of frisson gruesomeness for readers or for people following along the trial, they serve an important function at the trial, because when it is clear that the prosecutor, in this case the younger prosecutor, William Moody, is referring to the skulls and that he opens up his black bags so that they can sort of be seen, Lizzie Borden faints. And this is something that creates some sympathy for her, and also particularly shows that she is someone who has a great deal of feeling underneath a sort of stoic demeanor that is read in very different ways by people depending upon whether they're sympathetic to her or not. So, for example, the Irish Catholic paper, that's pretty hostile to Lizzie Borden, both before and after the trial, describes her as the sphinx of coolness, whereas more sympathetic reporters, particularly from Protestant papers and also many of the out-of-town papers who sent correspondents and columnists to cover the trial, think of that demeanor, that composure, as something that signals kind of true Yankee grit and a ladylike demeanor. She's, in fact, not just hysterical. She's able to bear up.
So in terms of a murder weapon, and you have these types of trials, of course, they always try to find the murder weapon. Was it ever found? I know that there was an axe presented at the trial. Did that seem like the axe that was used in the execution of the two individuals, or were there problems with that?
The absence of a definitive murder weapon is another point favoring the defense. And in fact, Governor Robertson, the folksy defense lawyer, makes a lot of jokes about the many, many hatchets and axes that are proposed as the possible weapon. The one that prosecution settles on is something called the Handleless Hatchet, and it becomes known as the hoodoo hatchet because it causes a lot of mischief during the trial. And the prosecution's theory is that Lizzie Borden used this particular hatchet, which was just an ordinary household tool, of which there would have been many in any household, and then that she broke off the handle because the handle would have been difficult to clean properly, and then put the cleaned blade, which is about 2.5 inches, sit it in the palm of your hand, and put it into a box of otherwise disused tools, covering it up with some fine ash to make it look like it had been just sitting in there in the box with the rusty tools for a long time. And it does seem to fit the wounds. The wounds are of many different shapes and sizes, but it could have made all of them, whereas most of the other proposed weapons probably couldn't have made each one. There are some specific things about it, namely that there's some gilt on it, which suggests that it was relatively new, and that's also found in one of the wounds. But this becomes an example of the way the defense is able to turn things. One of the policemen basically contradicts the line of how this was discovered, which lends credence to the defense theory that the police basically were just overwhelmed by these murders, and they just had to find somebody to pin them on. And so they pinned them on Lizzie Borden, and that this particular weapon was just part of the police cover-up.
Lizzie Borden was a very religious person, according to the record. She was also involved in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. I think there was aspects of your book where you talk about some of these groups are saying she is targeted specifically because of this, and, she's the victim.
Yes, Lizzie Borden receives the support of the local and national organizations to which she belonged. As you point out, one of them is the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and they, in fact, petitioned the governor of Massachusetts to let her out pending her trial, which was something that was not permitted under Massachusetts law, that she was someone who deserved some sort of special treatment. And the church that Lizzie Borden had been active in during her life also supported her. And the minister, attended the trial with her every day and offered moral support and showed effectively that her community was behind her. And there are also some, including suffragists, who argued that, or who used this trial as a way to argue that women should be able to serve as jurors, because otherwise Lizzie Borden would not be tried by a jury of her actual peers. The fact that only men were allowed to serve was a sign of great unfairness. I probably should just note parenthetically that it was probably to Lizzie Borden's benefit. There were no women on the jury because there were a number of women, more than half on many days, who attended the trial, and they formed a sort of self-constituted second jury. And they seemed a lot more hostile to Lizzie Borden, or at least less sympathetic, much more likely to read her behavior in a negative way.
So in terms of the jury, how quickly do they render their verdict? And then what happens to Lizzie Borden after that?
The trial goes on for over 2 weeks, which is really a long time for a trial in that era. Yet, despite that, the jurors are unanimous on the first ballot, and they only sit in the jury room for another hour and a half so that they can appear relatively deliberate or deliberative and out of respect, really, for the prosecution, which suggests that they really didn't find any of the prosecution argument very convincing, that they were much more persuaded that this simply could not have happened in this manner. So the courtroom erupts in cheers when this is announced, and there's a festival aspect to the crowd outside as well when news of Lizzie Borden's acquittal reaches them. She then goes home to Fall River with her sister and with some other supporters. But she finds very quickly that people who supported her during the trial cool in their enthusiasm for her once, she's out of danger. And perhaps most poignantly, she finds that the pews around her at the church are empty. And so she's given a very clear message that she's really not welcome. And she and her sister decide to leave the small house in which they lived with their father and stepmother. And Lizzie Borden's dissatisfaction with her living situation had been something that was pointed to as a motive at the trial. And she and her sister moved to a large house in the Hill District, which is the elite residential district. And instead of, living down her notoriety, she pretty much just lives it up, at least in Fall River terms. She has the big house. She has a car and a chauffeur. She has the seats built up into the back of the car so that her dogs can see out the window. She attends the theater in Boston. And she does nothing that suggests any kind of penance or enduring grief or any of the things that were sort of expected of her. What I find interesting is that she chose to live there, though, that she could have taken her inheritance and lived in a bigger city somewhere. And although she might not have been anonymous, she wouldn't have been as much of a notorious figure. But it seemed that she just preferred to live in Fall River. I've always thought that shows something of her nerve, that she was willing to just stick it out, even as she was effectively shunned. And also the parochialism, that on some level she kind of couldn't imagine any other place than the place in which she was born.
There's a chilling rhyme that a lot of people know, even if they don't know the specifics of the case or the trial, and that's Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Now, that, of course, is not accurate, as you detailed, but it seems to implicate her long term. So for those afterward, even though the jury found her not guilty, and for those just in passing who know the story, they seem to think she's very guilty.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea that she's acquitted at trial and then convicted by rhyme. There's also a sense that there's something tribal about the response of the people in the town. The verdict definitely splits the community, so that the same people who were upset at the light or the preferential treatment she received in the lead up to her arrest, and these are the Irish immigrants, for example, who would have been reading the Fall River Globe, also, think this is just another case of somebody with money and being able to work the system. But in terms of the smaller part of Fall River from which she came, it's almost as if they backed her, against outsiders and then exacted their own punishment. That there's something, anthropological about the way that they handled it. That it's a tribal circling of the wagons against outsiders, particularly since the idea that she could have done such a thing, that somebody who seemed, like a relatively normal, if not the most pleasant person, but, someone who was active in the good works of her town, particularly in her church, the idea that she could just pick up a hatchet and kill her father and stepmother is something that was, was quite threatening, because if that could be true, and really that didn't mean that, she had the kind of essential goodness that was imputed to women of a certain class in that era, if she wasn't physically incapable of doing that kind of thing, as well as morally incapable of it, then, what did that mean about the other hierarchies in the town and the naturalness of those? So it certainly came to be seen within the wider communities that she was probably guilty, because there seemed to be nobody else who could have done it. But at the same time, it wasn't something that they liked to talk about. When I have been asked about this, I often say that if I were on the jury, I think I would have voted to acquit too. There is still this question of, like, where was the blood? Even if she did burn a dress. And there's this weird part of the story. Sometimes it's hard to explain, so I don't always tell this part of the story. But you may remember there's this bucket of cloth that are soaking in the basement, which was a typical place for people to leave menstrual cloths. And once the police find out about it and check with the doctor, they're like, okay, well, we don't ever need to talk about that again. And when it is in danger of coming up on trial, both sides, wave it away. Nobody wants to talk about it. So that could have explained, that was a way that she could have cleaned herself up. But even then, it's still hard to imagine that there would have been no, that really could have cleaned up everything, and that there was no spatter.
So the last thing I have for you, and, if you take all the time that you spent, and you said you were interested in this a very long time ago, back when you were in college. Not that I'm not making a comment.
Oh, it's a while ago. It's a long time ago, Rob.
But having said that, after all of the research and you've looked into it, of course, you've written this great book, A Trial of Lizzie Borden, A True Story. What happened that day?
Well, I think we'll never know. And that is something that makes it such an interesting story in a way that we can't ever definitively have a solution. And there's a sense, I think, that if you strip out some of the historical specificity of the case, I mean, which are things that, you and I are fascinated by, you think that this is really just almost like a mythic tale of a very unhappy family trapped in a space together with all the tensions that generates. And so I think the tragic element of it makes it one that endures and one in which, we all feel interested in the solution.
Well, if you were the prosecuting attorney, and I know that you have a distinguished law background, so if you're the prosecuting attorney at that time and you're making your final summation, what would you say about Lizzie Borden's situation?
I think that Hosea Knowlton makes about the best case he can in his closing argument. He argues that Lizzie Borden has exclusive opportunity and also motive, that there's really no one else in the world who wanted Abby Borden dead. And, even if you can imagine that someone might have wished ill of Andrew Borden because of his hard business dealings. As I said, he was a bit of a miser, so he rubs people the wrong way in that regard. That there's really nobody else who wanted Abby Borden dead. And so if you look at the combination of the two, and also if you look at the things that the jury actually doesn't get to hear about, namely the poison and Lizzie Borden's shifting stories about her whereabouts, then it's hard to see how anyone else could have done it. But I think as we see from the jury that, this was really never a case of reasonable doubt. You're not unanimous on the first ballot if you view this as a case where you have to go slowly through the evidence together and parse out what you think is real or incriminating and not incriminating, or weigh the different possibilities. This is really not about reasonable doubt. It's about having a kind of unreasonable certainty that such a thing could not be possible, that a daughter who had led up until that moment a relatively normal, blameless, even religious life would suddenly kill her father and stepmother. Actually, I should say that many people thought that a woman could kill her stepmother. There's a lot to the fairy tale trope of the wicked stepmother that enters into the case. But the prosecution struggled, as would anybody, but particularly in that era, the idea that Lizzie Borden might have killed her father, particularly if it was a question of financial independence. It's just such a violation of, what we expect in a family.
Well, thanks a lot, Cara. I really appreciate it. And of course, the book, The Trial of Lizzie Borden, A True Story. Thanks for opening that case back up again and presenting some new information in our talk today.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to talk with you, Rob. I appreciate it.
I would like to thank my guest, legal scholar and author, Cara Robertson. And if you would like to get her new book, The Trial of Lizzie Borden, A True Crime Story, simply click on the link in the description below. Of the book, the New York Times says, enthralling, Robertson reopens the case and presents the evidence afresh. Our featured brew was axe murderer Imperial Stout from Moon Tower Sudworks of Houston, Texas. If you liked our talk today, please share this episode with a friend. All of the directories have an easy-to-use sharing function. And remember, once again, subscribe to the podcast. For more information on featured authors and books, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page. And you can check out our YouTube channel as well. The music was provided by the great North Carolina band Bones Fork. And if you want information on their new album, Beautiful Circle, just click on the link. It's in the description also. Finally, to our growing list of listeners and supporters from several countries, hundreds of cities across America and the globe for that matter, I have to say once again, thank you. There are many more great episodes on the way. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.